found. Initially, a number of cargo ships were equipped with catapults that supported one Hurricane fighter. The role of this CAM, or catapult aircraft merchantman, however, was not anti-submarine operations. It was to shoot down the German Condor reconnaissance bomber, which was a significant threat to convoys as they approached the United Kingdom. The CAM ships were also used extensively on the Arctic convoys. Their main disadvantage was that the aircraft could not be reused, as it had to ditch at the end of its sortie. A further development of this was the Merchant Aircraft Carrier, or MAC, that was a bulk carrier, a tanker or grain ship, with a wooden flat deck built along its length above the hull. This deck meant that the MAC could continue to carry its cargo, but could also launch and recover a small number of aircraft, usually swordfish or albacores. These aircraft, although unsuitable for other duties, were ideal for short-range anti-submarine operations. The final development along these lines was the dedicated escort aircraft carrier. These were either built from scratch or converted from existing hulls. Almost all were built in the United States, and they served not only as anti-submarine carriers, but also as support fleet carriers, largely in the Pacific. One of these could provide almost permanent air cover for a convoy, its only serious limitation being the weather. It could carry up to 30 aircraft, including both fighters and anti-submarine aircraft such as the Grumman Avenger. The first German submarines, or U-boats, were based on designs which bore a striking resemblance to the Ub-2 type submarines introduced by the Germans near the end of the First World War. The Type 1A was a medium-sized boat of 600 tons, based on a submarine being built for Turkey. Only 2 were constructed, and they were relegated to training duties on the outbreak of hostilities. The Type 2A was a small coastal submarine. Although 6 were built, their part in the war was also very restricted, mainly due to their range of only just over 1,000 miles. The Types 2B, C and D were modifications of this design. Again, their relatively small size of about 300 tons limited their wartime activity considerably. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought by 2 main types of U-boat, the medium-range Type 7 and the long-range Type 9, with production concentrated on these 2. Both had been designed in the mid-1930s, yet were not surpassed until the latter stages of the war. The Type 7 had a displacement of some 700 tons, although later variants reached almost 1,000. They were 220 feet long and equipped with 5 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 1 aft. Altogether, they carried 14 torpedoes, or mines. Using their diesel engines on the surface, they boasted a radius of action of some 6,500 miles, although the Type 7C-42 and other later versions could manage almost 10,000 miles. Submerged using batteries, the Type 7 could manage about 80 miles at 4 knots. They carried a crew of 44, and if necessary, could dive to about 650 feet. The Type 9 were somewhat larger, with earlier versions displacing just over 1,000 tons, growing to 1,600 tons with the Type 9D2. Early versions had a radius of over 8,000 miles, growing to 11,000 miles as the design evolved. They could carry up to 22 torpedoes or mines for their 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of which were in the bow and 2 located in the stern. They carried crews of about 55. Both classes could remain submerged for about 24 hours. After that, they would have to surface to recharge their batteries and replace the stale air inside the U-boat. Both types carried a deck gun armament, mainly for use against merchant ships, but later they were used more for self-defense when the submarines were caught on the surface by aircraft. As this possibility became increasingly common, more anti-aircraft guns were added. The larger gun carried on the foredeck was a 3.5-inch on the Type 7 or a 4-inch on the Type 9. A variety of 2 or 3 37mm and 20mm guns constituted the secondary armament. Later in the war, the larger gun was replaced on some boats by additional anti-aircraft guns. To support these classes, special supply submarines were built large enough to carry supplies, enabling the attack U-boats to remain on station longer. Previously, they could only lengthen their patrols by storing food and other supplies in existing living compartments, leaving the conditions on board even more squalid than they were normally. Such milchcow submarines displaced almost 2,000 tons and could carry up to 432 tons of oil, in addition to food and other supplies. Only 10 were commissioned. By limiting large-scale production of U-boats to the two main designs, the Germans found it difficult to improve performance, whereas British and American boats were constructed in classes built either for a specific purpose or to reflect technical advances. The relatively small size of most U-boats also limited how much additional equipment, like new communication systems or radars, could be fitted. Living conditions on both these classes were poor. The crew had to sleep wherever they could find space, which was often on top of the torpedoes. A crew had to share one toilet. The temperature could be very hot or freezing cold. Air conditioning was non-existent. With little room for food or water, rations were basic, and the crew often went for weeks or months without washing or shaving. After being underwater for hours, the air would become stale, and there was always the possibility of a slow, lingering death or of instantaneous destruction. But by 1943, it was becoming more obvious that these outdated designs would not be able to match new Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques. New concepts had to be found. The first of these was the schnorkel-fitted high-speed submarine with a much greater battery capacity, designed for continuous submerged patrols. Such submarines would be far less vulnerable to the long-range aircraft the Allies were now using to hunt for submarines on the surface. At the same time, the gun armament was to be sacrificed for a much more streamlined hull, with a resulting increase in speed. Over 12 knots could be maintained underwater, a substantial improvement on the 4 knots achieved by the earlier designs. Two types of submarine were to be built using these principles: the Type 21 for long-range deep-sea patrols, and the Type 23 for coastal duties. Their high underwater speeds could only be maintained for short periods before the batteries needed recharging. The answer to this problem was a gas-driven closed turbine, which would be independent of external air. This system had been developed by an engineer called Helmut Walter, who used hydrogen peroxide as the gas. Development was slow, however, and only a few experimental submarines were built. No U-boats using this system ever entered service. On the whole, German submarines were good conventional types, well fitted for their purpose, but the German Navy stayed with the early submarines for too long before incorporating radical technologies. By the time they became available, it was too late. The battle had been lost. Submarines are by nature lone hunters, and initially Dönitz used them to act independently in areas where Allied shipping was bound to turn up. In the early stages of the war, these tended to be the western approaches to the United Kingdom or in the North Sea. As Allied responses became more successful and as more U-boats became available, Dönitz moved them further west and deeper into the Atlantic. After the fall of France, when the ports of the French Atlantic coast became available, he pushed this boundary much further west. By that stage, U-boats could operate almost to the North American coastline. When the United States entered the war, submarines were deployed as far south as the Caribbean, with notable success. But to remain effective for long periods, U-boats operating in these distant waters had to be resupplied regularly. Initially, this was achieved by the use of disguised merchant ships. Thanks to good intelligence, the Allies soon located and destroyed these hidden enemies. Dönitz then had to turn to the milchcow supply submarines for replenishing supplies. Dönitz claimed that the tactic of the wolf pack was his own invention, but in fact such methods had been used to attack Allied shipping in the First World War. However, Dönitz developed the concept much further, especially when he was able to deploy over 40 U-boats into the Atlantic at any one